Previously on the British Broadcasting Century.
The BBC and the General Strike. Our multi-part centenary special is underway, but not much else is in Britain 100 years ago. The presses have almost entirely stopped printing. One of the few newspapers to get out is Winston Churchill's rather biased British Gazette, and he'd like an audio version, known as the BBC. It's still thought likely the government will commandeer the British Broadcasting Company. So John Reith, its managing director, needs to do all he can to preserve the independence of Auntie Beeb, which may mean sacrificing a little of its impartiality. In other words, while it technically doesn't pick a side, it is at the beck and call of the British government. How can one be fair in such circumstances? Or is it, as Winston Churchill says, that one cannot be impartial between the fire and the fire brigade?
This is the second episode of our centenary special, the BBC and the General Strike, in 5 steps, or 5 oversteps, here on the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London Calling.
Hello, welcome to the podcast. I'm Paul Carenza, and see the previous episode for what's been going on in the world of the BBC of 1926. There is a general strike underway. Various industries have down tools in support of the miners.
Not a penny off the pay, not a second on the day.
The general strike now enters its third full day. It's Thursday, the 6th of May, 1926.
The wireless shops in Plymouth have become resorts for those anxious for the latest news.
One of the few newspapers still printing is the Western Morning News. They report that those without wireless sets at home have been gathering outside shops that sell them. Meanwhile, the Leeds Mercury reports,
everywhere there is a thirst for information, and dense crowds gather on the pavements to read notices or news bulletins posted by some of the big department stores. Wireless shops are surrounded during the broadcasting hours.
There are loudspeakers put up in places like Horse Guards Parade in London. Some lovely pictures of that. Do join British Broadcasting Century Facebook group and you can see that. Pictures and news items galore posted thanks to our good friend Andrew Barker. Thank you, Andrew. So back then, John Reith is accompanied by John Davidson, who you may recall from last episode is our middleman, we're calling him. He's a government chap, but he's in charge of news and communications there. He's liaising with John Reith and the BBC as to how to get the message out there via wireless. A middleman trying to pursue a middle ground, certainly compared to Winston Churchill. So Reith and Davidson are visiting the Prime Minister at Number 10's Cabinet Room to confirm what is the BBC position. Will it be taken over? What are the expectations as far as the government's concerned? Reith noted that he was uncharacteristically a little scared, though not nervous as such. He was glad to know the Prime Minister generally agreed with him, that
it'd be far better to leave the BBC with a considerable measure of autonomy and independence.
There were grumbled the Cabinet, in particular Churchill, didn't like it.
There's an invitation for Reith to sit in on the Cabinet Committee at the Home Office. Reith must have thought his dreams were coming true. The place in society he always dreamed of, even if it were in a time of crisis.
I was invited to attend that committee, which I think was rather unusual. And Chicks was in the chair, Johnson Hicks, Home Secretary, the minister particularly responsible for keeping the country moving. Chicks read out a statement from the Prime Minister, which was quite categoric.
It is stated to the ministers that the BBC is to be left alone, not taken over.
And finished with that remark. The Prime Minister is prepared to trust the Managing Director, Mr. Reith.
Most agree, but Churchill.
Immediately, Churchill burst out, fulminating against absolutely wrong.
Said it was monstrous not to use such an instrument to the best possible advantage.
The BBC is that instrument.
We decided to leave the BBC. Some of the ministers who would prefer to take it over. I was never one of them.
One minister at that cabinet meeting was Sir Samuel Hoare.
I always thought it was better to have this semi-independent body giving the news to the country in addition to the official propaganda.
Churchill continued shouting at the ministers.
Chicks, to my surprise, after listening to this for a little bit, said, oh, well, this is a division opinion. We'd have to report back to the Cabinet that we haven't agreed.
So Reith quietly sidles out.
They are apparently finished with broadcasting.
Other things to discuss instead.
So John Davis and I went out of the room immensely disappointed.
Reith's philosophy.
The BBC must not become the mouthpiece of sectional interests.
For several days, we just didn't know where we were. There was no decision one way or the other.
That evening, 6th of May, there are phone calls from head office to BBC's regional stations to make sure that all of the station directors across the land are on the same page. Tread carefully. Don't put on the air anything that could be that controversial, certainly not anything that prolongs the general strike. If in doubt, leave it out. Reith's trying to get the entire BBC on board with where he's at. In his pre-BBC days, John Reith has battled unions before when he was managing the engineering works in Scotland in 1920. He has sacked strikers. Back then, he was no fan of organised labour. There were questions at this point whether or not the general strike was actually illegal. That's a question that would rumble on for the next few days. The government seeks strike breakers to help get certain areas moving, saying there'll be no sanctions for you if you come and help us. Churchill's British Gazette prints, "The general strike is a challenge to Parliament and is the road to anarchy and ruin." Friday, 7th of May.
This is the BBC. The government points out that the circulation of alarmist rumours, such as savings banks ceasing payment, etc., is a criminal offence. Improved services have been maintained during the day on the Southern Railway. Waterloo Station in particular has resumed a considerable amount of its normal busy appearance. Ships have been cleared by voluntary labour. Day services have been continued on the cross-channel route, and the Secretary of X-Rays Limited states that all hospitals and radiologists in the Midlands requiring X-ray films and accessories can obtain delivery on application.
We were broadcasting news about the success of the strikers in particular actions, where far more harm would have been caused if we hadn't. And Churchill wouldn't or couldn't or wouldn't see that. Hundreds of people knew that the big powerhouse down the road here was put out of action. Hundreds and thousands probably. And the BBC broadcast that. And Churchill fulminated about that. Broadcasting success of the strikers.
Later saying,
"I decline utterly to be impartial between the fire brigade and the fire."
To the very end he kept up his grumbling in the cabinet and with Stanley Baldwin.
The cruise of the liner Arcadian to the Canary Islands, Madeira and Morocco, due to start on Monday next, has been cancelled. Government announcement. All ranks of the armed forces of the Crown are hereby informed that any action which they may find it necessary to take in an honest endeavour to aid the civil power will receive, both now and afterwards, the full support of His Majesty's government. The country is quiet generally.
There are some inaccuracies creeping into some of the news bulletins. Today's news, Friday 7th of May, includes the strike breaking down in Oxford and Salisbury. There's talk of engine men and firemen returning to work. Not true. Some of those inaccuracies made it to the British Workers newspaper. That's the trade union's own newspaper. But they print a correction when they find out from locals it's not the case. The BBC are asked to announce a correction and they decline to correct the narrative. Because a weakening strike is what John Reith really wants. That helps the government out, and that helps a takeover of the BBC be staved off. Meanwhile, John Reith is all over these news bulletins. He's worried the news gathering is too slow and inefficient. One thing they do is they separate the transport news from the other news. So transport updates will now go out at 6:30pm and 11pm. Essentially, that's like traffic and travel updates. Rather heightened, of course, given the chaotic transportation or lack of it. And that keeps the other news bulletins free for general news. Dublin Radio 2RN starts broadcasting news as well, to the upset of Irish newspaper workers. I think they think if the BBC are doing it, we can here too. And this is where the Archbishop of Canterbury starts to enter the fray. His proposal for a solution is printed in the British Worker, not the British Gazette, Churchill's one. And the Archbishop wants Reith to let him on the air as well. He wants to broadcast a manifesto of church leaders to call off the strike and negotiate.
I had a letter delivered by him from the Archbishop enclosing what he wanted to say. It was near enough unexceptionable. Just an appeal to the government to be, as the Archbishop thought, I suppose, generous and large-minded, and not stand on the letter of the law. All right, I gave that to Davis, and I said, I'm in favour of letting the Archbishop read this.
In fact, the Archbishop of Canterbury has at this point already run the speech past the Prime Minister, who says that he won't stop it being broadcast. He would just prefer that it isn't broadcast. Over to Reith then.
Davidson didn't agree, but he didn't disagree. I saw he had a reservation. So he took it along to Baldwin, and he came back to see me, and he said, no, the Prime Minister would rather you didn't do that.
But he would not tell Reith what to do. Rather tricky for Reith, he had to read between the lines somewhat as to what best to do, without proper direct instruction. How very British.
And there was I, you see, in the invidious position of having to arbitrate between the Prime Minister of the country and the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Between Premier and Primate.
Like Ulysses, he was trying to navigate his ship between the monster of Scylla and the whirlpool of Charybdis.
Because I was so frightened of what Churchill would make of it, he would have succeeded in swinging the cabinet over to taking possession of the BBC.
This fear certainly plays on Reith's mind throughout this. Later on, he wrote,
Under the emergency regulations, the government would have been well within their powers if they had taken over Savoy Hill.
We're doing the story of the general strike in 5 oversteps, and overstep number 3. Voices are kept off the air by John Reith. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Ramsay MacDonald, and representatives of the TUC will not broadcast, but the Prime Minister will.
If I had allowed the Archbishop to make that statement against the wishes of the Prime Minister, so I told the Archbishop I was sorry I wouldn't agree to his broadcasting.
Must have been quite tricky for him, because this is a man of great faith who has been trying to suck up to the church authorities for quite some time. And now here he was, denying a platform to the Archbishop.
Was I right? I think I was right, but I hated it.
So the Archbishop is banned. Reith states in his diary that he put it as nicely as he could. I imagine Dr. Strangelove's president telling the Russian premier nicely about the bomb. And so Friday the 7th of May ends without much of the working week, featuring much working from many industries. The strikers are really noticing now that actually what they hear on the BBC does not properly reflect how things are going on the ground. Some people loyal to the strikers even call the BBC
the British Falsehood Company.
In-house too, some BBC staff privately object to all of this censorship and imbalance. As far as Reith is concerned, national duty comes first.
Complete impartiality during the emergency was, in the circumstances, not to be expected.
Which brings us to Saturday the 8th of May. The Archbishop saga rumbles on. Reith phones him, writes a letter, meets up with him for a long chat, explains himself all over again. The Archbishop was typically generous in his summation of events. Talking about Reith,
the matter has evidently distressed him terribly, and he certainly squirmed somewhat at what I said in my letter this morning about the churches being refused a hearing at a great historic juncture. It would be easier for him to let the government commandeer the BBC.
The Archbishop does point out to Reith that he is actually preaching on air the next day. That's the Sunday, and he's got one of his regular broadcasts. Is that okay to go ahead? It's a simultaneous broadcast from St Martin in the Fields on Trafalgar Square. Reith says, well, yeah, that's still on, but he should probably see the sermon in advance, make sure it's not too rabble-rousing. Reith checks it over, sees it's fine. The Archbishop's Sunday broadcast, in a religious capacity, can go ahead. Reith just wants to restrain a more political message from the Archbishop. Elsewhere, the government is doing their best to recruit extra people to help them out. The Civic Constabulary Reserve is formed. In the words of Churchill's British Gazette,
patriotic citizens are willing to give such time as they can spare to helping the police in their duty of keeping order and protecting the public.
25,000 of them, according to Churchill's figures, but he still wants more. Plain clothes, but
supplied with armlets, steel helmets and truncheons.
Looks like it's getting a little bit feisty on the streets there. Ex-military would be paid to join up and police the streets. But the main thing on Saturday is the Prime Minister. He calls Reith to take him up on his offer that Reith had made earlier that week, which was an invitation to broadcast. Yes, the PM will finally broadcast to the nation. But where to do it? Savoy Hill, the BBC HQ, could have protesters, a mob even. Just 4 months earlier, that BBC broadcast, which was a hoax admittedly, had reported on mob rule around London.
London calling. The crowd is preparing to demolish the Houses of Parliament with trench mortars.
Roasting VIPs alive, blowing up the Savoy Hotel and felling Big Ben.
Accepted by the crowd, roasted alive, hanging the Minister of Traffic.
Yes, we featured it on the podcast. It was all not true, but still, there's a memory of this fiction. Could it now become fact? So, Savoy Hill maybe is not the place for the Prime Minister's broadcast, even with the dozen police officers around it and the Prime Minister's security guards. The atmosphere is febrile, so Reith has a solution that would also elevate him. His own home. The Prime Minister can broadcast from John Reith's study. At 6:45 p.m. on that Saturday, engineers go to Reith's house in Barton Street to make sure it's all fine, and by 8 o'clock all is ready ahead of a 9:30 broadcast. Reith collects the Prime Minister himself at 9:10 in his Austin car, and the Prime Minister is glad to hear that they won't be going to Savoy Hill. John Reith's wife Muriel makes small talk with the Prime Minister before his broadcast. Then the Prime Minister shows Reith his speech, asks him what he thinks of
this tripe,
to quote the Premier. Any comments or suggestions? Asks the Prime Minister. Reith adds a presumably on page 1 and says to the Prime Minister, it'll have to do. Wow. This surely is another overstep. Overstep number 4, John Reith, the managing director of the BBC, rewrites the Prime Minister's speech for him and indeed rewrites the last page while the Prime Minister is still reading it. The Prime Minister wanted to end his speech with something personal. John Reith agreed and said, yes, something about trusting you. How about this?
I am a man of peace. I am longing and working and praying for peace, but I will not compromise the dignity of the British Constitution.
The Prime Minister says,
excellent. Write it down if you have a legible hand.
The thing is, the two men are of a very similar view generally. Not a fan of the strike, but they think that caution and diplomacy are the best way through tricky times. So Reith then introduces the Prime Minister.
London and all stations calling. The Prime Minister.
He nearly burned his eyebrows as Baldwin lit his pipe during John Reith's introduction as well. And he went over and sat in the armchair next to that middleman of the government, John Davidson, although Reith found that as he leant back in the armchair, the chair creaked a little too much, so he got up again. Didn't want to disturb the broadcast, plus also gave him a great excuse to peer over the Prime Minister's shoulder as he was broadcasting his speech.
The general strike has now been in progress for nearly a week, and I think it is right as Prime Minister that I should tell the nation once more.
He goes on to explain that negotiations with the coal industry have been going on for 9 months, but he decries that a general strike was called while they were still negotiating. They're holding the country to ransom. Baldwin tells the nation,
the Trade Union Council has decreed that the railways shall not run, that the unloading of ships shall stop, and that no news shall reach the public.
No news? Well, not with the BBC around. Here they are, giving the Prime Minister a platform to give his side of the story, that the trade unions'
method of helping the miners is to attack the community, seeking to dislocate the life of the nation and try to starve us into submission.
He demands that before negotiations resume, there must be an end to the strike. The strikers are thinking the other way around. But then Baldwin gets to the end of his speech. The words,
I am a man of peace, I am longing and...
Hang on. Reith is there, pacing the room, going,
I will not compromise the dignity. Dignity? Is this the right time for dignity?
So as Baldwin speaks, Reith leans over the Prime Minister, grabs the last page, makes a few amendments.
I will not compromise the dignity, safety and security of the British Constitution.
Baldwin rolls with the changes,
almost imperceptibly.
At the door listening in is Reith's own mother, not via wireless, but by bending an ear to Reith's closed study door. So Reith brings her in, introduces her, she tries to get away, but this is what he's ever wanted, surely, introducing his own mother to the Prime Minister. He'd written in his diary years before how he wanted to be a significant figure, and this was such a moment. She said she was proud to be there with the Prime Minister after his speech. Baldwin said he had to dash. He'd not told his wife that he was actually even leaving the house, let alone broadcasting to the nation, so she'd not known he was coming here, even with a dozen police flanking his exit. Reith then kicked himself, said, I should have invited her as well. She could have spoken to my wife, and so on. Reith then drives the Prime Minister home. What a weird bromance this was for a few minutes. No one listening at the time knew this was coming from Reith's own home, with words from Reith's own hand. But what about the Prime Minister's political opponent, the leader of the opposition, Ramsay MacDonald? Would he get a chance on the air to respond? He wanted one, but he was denied any airtime. That was to come on the following Monday, the 10th of May. We'll get to Monday on the next episode of the podcast. But to wrap up this one, let's look at Sunday the 9th of May, a day of rest, surely, even in the general strike. Well, the Archbishop of Canterbury, you may recall, was banned from giving his own speech about the strike, but he is due to give a broadcast. It's Sunday, and he's got one of his regular broadcasts from St Martin in the Fields Church. It's just a sermon. So will he get his chance? So he's not banned from that, just banned from his more political strike-related plea for peace and negotiation. The following week in Parliament, it's actually asked whether the Archbishop may have had his Sunday broadcast banned as well, if it was thought to include any of his terms for peace suggested on behalf of the United Churches. No smuggling politics through the back door via religion. Reith had checked the Archbishop's sermon, no chances being taken here. Reith thought it
quite innocuous,
so that was fine to be broadcast. Elsewhere across the country, there are sermons generally preaching order and duty, and some of these make it onto the air across the regions of the BBC. Meanwhile, in the Catholic Church, and not broadcast, Cardinal Bourne at High Mass calls the general strike a sin against God. Bit much?
Here is the last news bulletin for today.
This news bulletin voiced by Charles Carpendale, Reith's deputy.
Following items of news indicate the general situation in the country.
Now, it's a recording from 6 years later when the BBC finally got a recording device, but there's every chance that Charles Carpendale was the newsreader at the time of the general strike.
Copyright in these items is reserved outside the British Isles.
That's why they got these voices back, to reenact what they'd done. Because, of course, it was all hands on deck, and Admiral Carpendale was quite used to that from his time in the Navy. If you wonder why Broadcasting House is designed like a massive ship, it's said that we can thank Admiral Carpendale for that. Anyway, back to his news bulletin.
At the High Mass in Westminster Cathedral today, His Eminence Cardinal Bourne made the following declaration. The time through which we are now passing is of exceptional character, and the present strike is of a nature quite unlike the many others which have preceded it. It is necessary that the Catholics should have clearly before their minds the moral principles which are involved. There is no moral justification for a general strike of this character. It is a direct challenge to a lawfully constituted authority and inflicts, without adequate reason, immense discomfort and injury on millions of our fellow countrymen. It is therefore a sin against the obedience which we owe to God, who is the source of that authority, and against the charity and brotherly love which we owe to our brethren.
But across the country, it seems that many churchgoers are in support of the strike. Church, it seems, is a good place to take the temperature of the nation that Sunday. Beyond church, there's an army cordon around London docks, and Reith spends most of the day at the Admiralty, where John Davidson oversees the government communications, and Reith and his team are vetting any BBC news bulletins, adding government messages as Davidson insists. As well as leaving staff at the Admiralty, John Reith has come away from the Admiralty with a new staff member for the Beeb as well. The Prime Minister's son-in-law, Captain Richard Monroe. Reith sees him doing odd jobs at the Admiralty, offers him a job at the Beeb. Monroe starts at the BBC that very day. There's Reith cosing up to the Prime Minister then and his family. Reith has got staff installed there, notably his Director of Publicity Gladstone Murray, who would ultimately become Assistant Controller of the BBC, then move to Canada and head up the public broadcasting in the BBC image over there. But during the general strike, Gladstone Murray is one of those few BBC folks at the Admiralty overseeing the communications going in and out, an extra editorial layer before news bulletins are heard by the British public. At the other end of that process, back at Savoy Hill, is Chief Engineer Peter Eckersley.
Of course, the general strike.
He's one of the news team over there, and he sees the text of news bulletins going out from the BBC's news gathering squad to the Admiralty, where the government add their layer, and Eckersley notices that when the bulletins come back, things have been taken out and some things have been added. Peter Eckersley.
Well, I suppose I should be untactful if I told the story, as I've told it in my book, about the general strike, but it was interesting because as chief engineer I had very little to do, and they gave me the job of seeing the news as it came in, and naturally I gave myself the job of hearing it as it came out. It was a little different.
The BBC and the general strike in 5 oversteps. Overstep number 5. The BBC censors the news, or at least excludes stories on one side. Eckersley felt hoodwinked. He said,
I shared with a few others the staggering experience of comparing all the news as it came in with that which was considered fit for public consumption. Many of those besides myself who'd been proselytising the BBC as the impartial public servant were bitterly disappointed. It was not so much that the news was altered as given bias by elimination. This, I now know, is an old trick, but it was new to me then.
That was the first time that I realised that perhaps this dream of mine, and it was a serious dream, that we had in the BBC a power which was independent of communal psychology, independent of current opinion, that it would be wise, witty, informed and cultured, was suddenly seen to be an instrument of government.
Had there been commercial stations, Labour would undoubtedly have had its own station to put its own point of view.
Interesting thought. Were there commercial radio back then? Were there competition? We could have had a very different general strike indeed.
It was a terrible disappointment, in a way, to me, who was an enthusiast for the idea, because I realised that an imperfect will, to whom the Lord gave, the Lord can take away. Therefore, admirable as the BBC is, one has got to ask oneself that fundamental question. Is a damnable principle justified by an admirable performance?
That evening on Sunday the 9th of May, an interesting moment, I think it's fair to say, occurs. Reith welcomes a VIP to the air. The Archbishop is not allowed, nor is Leader of the Opposition Ramsay MacDonald. Instead they have Earl Grey, descendant of the Tea Guy, former Liberal Foreign Secretary. Now, this isn't so much an interesting story about Earl Grey himself, but what happens when Reith goes to collect him. Reith has said to Earl Grey, I will pick you up, maybe have a cup of tea while there. And Grey is actually at Churchill's house. So Reith and Churchill meet face to face. They'd met earlier in the week at a big cabinet meeting, but this is a moment to lock horns together for the first time. Churchill says, come in for coffee. Surely for an Earl Grey, but anyway. And Churchill says to Reith, almost not knowing who he is, apparently, are you with the BBC? Reith says, I'm the managing director. Churchill swings around and shouts, are you Mr. Reith? I've been hunting for you all week. Reith says he's been working the entire time, very busy, but he was available for a meeting. Churchill should have invited him to one if he was that indignant with the BBC. He was really very stupid, notes Reith. Churchill and Reith are not friends, ever. Now, Lord Grey, who's being picked up there, probably finding all this rather awkward, he agrees with Reith about BBC independence. Thinks, yes, the government should leave them alone. Churchill, of course, thought rather differently. Walking him to his car, Churchill says to him, I heard you had been badly wounded in the war. In the head, wasn't it? Reith replies, yes, but that has no bearing on my present attitude. And Reith and Grey drive off to the studio, leaving, as Reith saw it, Churchill embarrassed. Although Churchill was probably thinking, what a zinger. Churchill probably thought that about most things he said. So that brings us to the end of the first week of the General Strike, the end of Sunday, the 9th of May. As for the 10th of May, well, you have to join us on this podcast on the 10th of May. Stay subscribed and the next part will appear for you here on
The British Broadcasting Century, presented and produced by me, Paul Carenza. Original music by Will Farmer, with nothing to do with the BBC of the present day. We're talking about ye olde British Broadcasting Company, of course. Any bits that are the BBC's are BBC copyright content reproduced courtesy of the British Broadcasting Corporation, all rights reserved. Do find us on Facebook and Blue Sky at BB Century, and I would love you to rate and review this show where you found it. It just helps us reach other ears. And of course, there's always patreon.com/Paul Carenza to help support this podcast for £5 a month, and you get readings, writings and videos as well.
Be informed, educated, entertained and subscribed for the next episode of the BBC and the General Strike here on the British Broadcasting Century.